Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to this webinar. This is a webinar on the Wellbeing Economy, and I'm Caroline Lucas. I'm the MP for Brighton Pavilion, and it's a pleasure to be chairing this evening. I'm talking very slowly because I can see that people are joining as I speak. We're up to 70 so far, but it's going up very fast. So everyone is incredibly welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Actually, I wanted to say that it's really heartening that we've had over 500 people registered for this event. So that's incredibly exciting. I'm going to say a few words just to set the scene and then introduce you to our speakers. So I think I'm fairly safe to just be saying a few words of introduction just now, just as people are still arriving. Maybe one thing to point out is to say that there is a link to the Wellbeing Economy Petition, which is on the official parliamentary website. That is going to be put in the chat. So please do sign that petition and share it if you haven't already. And also to say we would love to hear about any plans or ideas that you might have for helping us reach 100,000 signatures, which we need to do by September. So if you have any brainwaves about that, then please do put those in the chat as well, because we absolutely need a creative and collaborative effort, and it would be lovely to see all of you as part of that. Okay, we're up to over 100 people now, so I will properly start. I wanted to say, actually, looking down the attendee list, it is so good to see such a range of people with us. We've got teachers, we've got doctors, we've got other NHS workers, we've got students, academics, activists, vet, engineers, environmental campaigners, business representatives, and many more, including at least one person who's described themselves as a domestic goddess. So you're all incredibly welcome. As the South African poet June Jordan wrote, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And we've got our work cut out for us, my friends. I wanted to also thank our co-hosts for this evening, especially CUSP, which is the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. They've been doing so much of the behind the scenes support. And then two other important points on logistics, and then we'll get started with the session proper. First is to say that we'll have roughly half an hour of speaker contributions. So there's plenty of time for Q&A, and we aim to finish at 7:15. And then a plea, can you use the chat function for chat and the Q&A to ask questions? Including the upvoting function on the Q&A, so that we can prioritize the most popular questions, because with several hundred people and more on the webinar, then it's much easier to do it that way. And apologies that we won't be able to reach everybody when it comes to the questions, but hopefully that upvoting can help us with that. So turning to the topic at hand, there is a new official parliamentary petition calling for a wellbeing economy. It's only very recently gone live, but it's already got over 2,000 signatures, and we very much hope that you'll join and put your signature on it too. This is a really splendid start, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the creator of the petition, Laura Sharples, who's with us tonight. She's a recent graduate, she's a Brighton resident and an activist. I'm really pleased to be supporting Laura's petition and to be collaborating to help get the numbers that it needs, because from my parliamentary perspective, a push for a wellbeing economy coming from every corner of the UK is something we so urgently need. We need it for climate action, for a thriving natural world, for a fairer and healthier society, for better jobs, and for future generations. And with the UK hosting COP26 and the G7 this year, we have a real chance to address the economic elephant in the room, essentially the relentless pursuit of infinite economic growth on a finite planet. That is a recipe, as we know, for human and ecological catastrophe. And we can do so much better. We can and we must redesign the economy to address the deep inequalities in our communities and to tackle the climate crisis. The wellbeing economy provides us with the principles and the policies to do exactly that. Now, like many others, this problem is not a new one. Governments and policymakers have known that we're on a collision course for decades, and yet they've chosen to stick with business as usual. But rather than quote from reams of OECD reports or government commissions or expert research reports to make this point, and all of those certainly exist, I was actually going to turn to one of my favourite children's books, The Lorax by Dr. Seuss, especially since this year is the 50th anniversary since the publication of the Lorax, although it still sounds so eerily topical today. And in that book, you might remember that a factory owner cuts down trees to make what he calls thneeds, regardless of whether anyone needs thneeds. And he works to bigger and bigger his factory until there are no more trees left and the countryside is barren and wasted. And I hope you'll indulge me while I read a bit out as our factory owner explains how it happened. And I'll just have a quick swig of water before I do. So this is from the Lorax, and this is our factory worker. And he says, "I meant no harm, I most truly did not, but I had to grow bigger, so bigger I got. I biggered my factory, I biggered my roads, I biggered my wagons, I biggered the loads of the thneeds I shipped out. I shipped them forth to the south, to the east, to the west, to the north. I went right on biggering, selling more thneeds, and I biggered my money, which everyone needs." There, my friends, in a nutshell, we have our current economic system designed to stimulate demand for products and services, whether or not there's any underlying need for them or demand for them, and ignoring the long-term capacity of the earth to meet that demand. I think what's exciting now is the momentum for change. The work of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Donut Economic Action Lab are just two examples of change makers just getting on with the practicalities of implementing a new economic approach. From national to local level, change is already happening. As the economist Kate Raworth told our recent parliamentary Green New Deal group inquiry, 21st century economics will be practiced first and theorized later. Communities and decision makers are implementing new economic approaches fit for today's challenges, where the economy serves the needs of people and planet rather than the other way around. And yes, as usual, Westminster is behind the curve. In national economic policy and globally via international trade policy, our government is doubling down on an economic dogma that is fueling the fires of the climate crisis and making our society more unequal and less resilient. And last month's budget is a prime example. Pitiful investment in green jobs, a new infrastructure bank without a watertight climate mandate, and a super deduction tax break, which risks turbocharging investment in fossil fuels. And there was no room for nature in the Chancellor's red box either. And that's despite the Treasury's own Dasgupta review, which explained that biodiversity loss is, and I quote, undermining nature's productivity, resilience, and adaptability, fueling extreme risk and uncertainty for our economies and well-being. The devastating impacts of COVID-19 and other emerging infectious diseases, of which land use change and species exploitation are major drivers, could prove to be just the tip of the iceberg if we continue on our current path. So that could scarcely be more clear. And as I said in the debate, in all seriousness, our health and prosperity would be better served by a chancellor who cares rather more about hedges and hedgehogs than he does about hedge funds. But the window of opportunity is open. That's the exciting thing. We have a real chance for a fundamental economic reset, to emerge from the pandemic on track to a greener and fairer and kinder economy, a well-being economy. And that's what this evening's session is all about. And to explore it in more detail, I just want to introduce you to our speakers. We have Laura Sharples, a Brighton resident, the Petition creator and founder of Wellbeing Economics Brighton. We're delighted to have Dr. Katherine Trebeck, author and co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and currently their advocacy and influencing lead. We have Beth Stratford, fellow at the New Economics Foundation and author of a report called The UK's Path to a Donut-Shaped Recovery, as part of her PhD at the University of Leeds, and Clive Lewis, Labour MP for Norwich South, who's been a shadow Treasury Minister during his impressive parliamentary career, and with whom it's a pleasure to work so closely, including as co-chairs of the APPG on the Green New Deal, to give just one example. So Laura, thank you again for starting this petition and for working with my team on this event and whatever comes next. And I'm really delighted to hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. I just wanted to start with a massive thank you. Thank you to everybody for attending this event and to everybody who's supported me in starting this petition and in all my activism so far. So just thank you, everyone. And I'd also like to say how honoured I feel to be a part of this really amazing panel with two really inspiring MPs and two really incredible female economists. So yeah, thanks everyone. So as Caroline said, my name is Laura. I'm the co-founder of Wellbeing Economics Brighton, and we're a citizen group which promotes the theory and practice of alternative economics to move us towards this goal of a wellbeing economy. And so I just wanted to share with you a few things that I've learned in my last year of economic activism. And the first thing is that I believe the economy is really about stories, but the mainstream stories and narratives which exist at the moment, they really work to disempower us by disconnecting us from each other, from our communities, from nature, and removing our agency. So one of these narratives is this idea of the economy as being something outside of our control and just a natural phenomenon that just sort of appeared. And stories like this are so strong that they actually supersede facts, figures, and the truth. And stories can only be replaced by other stories. And so our job now is to empower citizens to recognize these narratives and replace them with new ones. So an alternative, or the alternative, is that the economy has been designed and that it can and must be redesigned if we are to find meaningful solutions to the many interconnected problems that we face. So I believe one of the biggest barriers that we face, if not the biggest, is making people believe that another way is possible. And I hope that by the end of this event, you will understand a little bit better how it is possible. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that WEB, our local group, is guided by this vision of a wellbeing economy as a destination, and also by certain values which we have decided are important to us. So, for example, intersectionality, solidarity, community, participation, and regeneration. And the rest we are figuring out as we go along. There is not one way that we get to the wellbeing economy. There are many. There are already so many incredible theories, models, and case studies. And we are all learning together, making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And I think as long as we're guided by a clear vision and these core human values, which we all share, and we keep the faith, we can get there together. And so coming back to my petition for a wellbeing economy. So yeah, the last time I checked, we have 2,200 signatures. And at 10,000, the government will give us a response, and at 100,000, it will be considered for a parliamentary debate. And we have until the 26th of September to reach that goal. And so we need the help of everyone here to help us reach 100,000 signatures. So I hope that you will all sign this petition and share it widely. But I want to ask you to go a step further and to actually engage people in a real face-to-face or Zoom-to-Zoom, whatever conversation about the wellbeing economy at work, at home, with your friends or within your activist circles, to really challenge those disempowering narratives and replace them with the empowering narratives, and to defeat this "it is what it is" spirit, and to actually help us get to this goal. And the final thing I wanted to say is that I would encourage you to find out who your local alternative economics group is, and just find out what they're doing, and maybe get connected with your own activist group or get involved. So that might be a donor economics group, it could be a rethinking economics group, a wellbeing economics hub, anything like that. And if there's no group near you that you can find and you think that you might like to start one, you are very, very welcome to message Web. I'll put the email in the chat, or myself, and we will be so happy to connect with you and give you any advice or support and answer any questions that you have. Yeah, thanks very much. Power to the people.
Fab, thank you so much, Laura. And yeah, you put it beautifully, the idea of only being able to to dislodge one story by presenting a new and better one. And I think that's exactly what you're doing and what this is all about. People are already in the chat and signing the petition. The petition is there in the chat. Apologies to people. I understand there have been a couple of difficulties for some people getting onto the webinar. They've been asked for a password, but I'm being assured that that is being sorted out. So if you were forced to arrive a little bit late because of that, then my apologies. Passing on now to Katherine. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks, Laura, for all you're doing. This is, I think, in a way, just epitomises so much the goals of a wellbeing economy, a young activist woman taking charge and saying we can do better than the economic system that's been imposed upon us. So to such an extent, you embody the very essence of what a wellbeing economy is about. So I'm really proud to be here with you and fellow panellists today, this beautiful, beautiful day up here in Glasgow, chatting about how we can create a better economic system. And I'm afraid, Caroline, I am going to quote from a government document because it's someone has to, but it's not a UK government document. It's from a UN report, and this is one of the most recent human development reports. And this is Akam Steiner, who's head of UNDP. And he says in the opening pages of this 400-page document, he says, humans have achieved incredible things, but we have taken the earth to the brink. We have ruptured inequalities, and record numbers of people around the world are being forced from their homes through conflict and crisis. These are the results, he says, of societies that value what they measure instead of measuring what they value. Now, I think he's got a hell of a point, and loath for me to criticise or disagree with Akam Steiner, but I actually think in places like the UK, it's no longer about need for more and more measurements. We count plenty of things here. Now is the time to pick up where our colleagues in the statistics offices have left off and get into the thick and dirty game of putting these measures into political policies, putting them into our accountability mechanisms, and using that to change the policy architecture so that we reshape, as Laura says, this is entirely possible to reshape the entire economic system away from one that is designed for and dependent on economic growth to one that is better than economic growth. And that's partly at the essence of the Wellbeing Economy agenda. In its most simplest form, we describe it as an economy that delivers social justice on a healthy planet. We worked with our member organisations a couple of years ago to really distill down what some of their key ideas and key principles for what the economy needed to be about. And we call these the 5 we all needs, that we all need our economy to deliver. And these are things like participation, connection, dignity, fairness, and nature. And imagine if we had an economic system designed for that. And one of the key questions there is moving away from our obsession about growth. We need to be much more fair weather friends of growth rather than its ever faithful followers. Take a qualitative lens to what we need more of and grow and nurture that and power down those things, those activities, those sorts of businesses that are not aligned with those 5 we all needs. And what is exciting, as Caroline said, there is momentum around this. There are so much cause for hope, so many corners that we can point to where we're seeing that sense of possibility that shows that this is feasible and this is desirable. You've probably seen on some of the documentation around tonight's event mention of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, and that's something that We All has instigated. And this is a group now of 5 governments, 4 of them led by women, which we can talk about later, but led by Scotland with New Zealand, Iceland, and recently joined by Finland and Wales. And these are governments who are saying, we recognise that in the 21st century, success cannot just be purely about faster GDP growth. It's about putting collective well-being at the heart of our economic systems. We see the results of citizens' assemblies in the last few months. They're citizens when they've come together to have the scope and the chance to deliberate and learn from each other, really pushing the envelope of the sort of policies that they want people in power to take to reshape how we respond to the climate emergency. We see cities around the world grappling with redesigning infrastructure, so in putting out places where communities can come together for choirs rather than just consumption. We see the OECD's work really about pushing well-being and designing policy making for their member states about how to put well-being into government policies. We see the work of the EU around the economy for the well-being, when that was led by the Finnish presidency, and subsequent initiatives there that CUSP has been a key part of. And we see businesses around the world saying, profit should be a means to an end rather than end in itself. And whether it's banks like Triodos Bank who are saying we want to use our financial system to invest in the sort of economic activities that we need more of in a wellbeing economy, whether it's businesses like Keep Cup that are a benefit corporation and saying they want to internalize all the environmental impacts of their activity, invest in their local communities. Whether it's businesses like Fairphone, another benefit corporation that's saying we have to move on from that planned obsolescence that's built into certain other models of phone and replace and redesign our products. And one of my favorites, whether it's worker cooperatives like this one that's just down the road from me here in Glasgow, Green City Whole Foods, it's been around since the 70s. And that's designed in a way to deliver benefits for its members rather than faster extraction of wealth upwards to remote shareholders. We see examples of this everywhere we turn. And the key thing now is to connect and amplify that work because it proves that change is possible. In the face of that, we see vested interests, we see path dependencies, and we see governments flinching from the monumental changes that are required, saying this is too big, this is enormous, we just need to go back to business as usual. And that's why, Laura, this petition that you've created is so incredibly important. Because if we can get to 10,000, if we can get to 100,000, it is going to demonstrate to government that there is demand there, that this is what people want, that they can be on the right side of history. So it is so important that everyone passes out the petition to as many people as you can and really build momentum around this so that governments have no excuse but to join us in building an economy that delivers social justice on a healthy planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katherine. That was really inspiring. And I don't know if it's just my ears playing up or whether you had your windows open, but there seemed to be a soundtrack of birdsong to everything you were saying, which was just the most beautiful thing.
Lovely. Let's go singing.
It was really beautiful. So thank you so much for that. Passing over now to Beth Stratford from NEF and University of Leeds. Really delighted you're with us, Beth.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'll just share my screen here. Let me know, did that work? You can see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to be drawing out some of the key conclusions, as Caroline said, from our report called UK's Path to a Donut-Shaped Recovery. The donut, for those of you who don't know, is an illustration of humanity's 21st century challenge of meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. It's a framework developed by Kate Raworth for measuring our progress really towards a well-being economy. So I'll just briefly, in this diagram here, the outer circle there represents the planetary boundaries, the ecological ceiling that we have to stay within. And Kate's innovation was to add this inner circle to the diagram based on the reflection that having access to too little of the Earth's resources is also a source of suffering for billions of people. So the inner boundary represents the sort of social foundation that everyone needs to enjoy a basic degree of freedom and health. And what we want to do is make sure there's no one left in that hole in the middle of the donut. We need to get within the green donut-shaped area. At the moment, there is a tension between those two goals, the goals of getting back within planetary boundaries and the goals of making sure that nobody falls short of life's essentials. But that tension isn't an inevitable fact of life. There is enough to go around. The problem is that our strategy for keeping everyone employed and housed and fed is capitalist growth with trickle down, basically. And we all know that that strategy hasn't worked very well. Nothing much has trickled down. And it's given the most powerful permission to consume way, way, way more than their fair share of planetary resources. And it now leaves us with an apparently horrible dilemma. Either we continue with consumption growth and trickle down and we destroy the Earth system that we depend upon, or we use environmental legislation and we reduce the consumption of resources, which would effectively make it impossible to go on growing the economy, meaning that that trickle dries up entirely and the economy slips into crises of unemployment and debt and destitution. So what can we do? That's the topic of our report. What needs to change to ensure that the economy can function and can meet everyone's needs without relying on continued consumption growth with trickle down? So I'm going to cover the 4 strategies here. Let's just see if you can get this next diagram. Yes, got it. The 4 strategies which relate to rent extraction, safeguarding basic needs, jobs and debt. So rent, when political economists talk about rent, they actually don't just mean incomes extracted by landlords, they mean incomes that are extracted by anyone in the economy who controls scarce or monopolized assets. So while most of us have to go out to work to earn our living, people who control scarce assets, land, housing, energy infrastructure, utilities, finance, intellectual property, they can extract unearned rents at the expense of everybody else. So one of the most important recommendations in our report is that we have to reduce and redistribute those rents. That's a huge project. In the report, we talk about some of the baby steps we can take as part of our recovery from COVID. So one example, at the moment, income that you get from ownership of assets, dividends, capital gains, things like that, are taxed at a lower rate than income that you get from actually going out to work, which is nuts. It should be the other way around. So taxing dividends, capital gains, monopoly profits, financial transactions, inheritance, all of these things would bring in much, much more revenue for us to work with, to then, moving on to strategy 2, safeguard basic needs. Now, in the UK, many of our essential goods and services like social care, energy, water, transport are controlled by private companies, and our ability to access those services depends on our economic fortune, which makes us really vulnerable if we fall on hard times. It also makes it nearly impossible to bring in carbon taxes that we so desperately need, because the poorest in our society are already struggling to cover the cost of energy and fuel. So if you raise the price, you just make those problems even worse. So what can we do about that? Well, we can extend this principle of free public services from healthcare and education to other areas like transport, water, energy, adult social care, childcare, so that everyone can access life's essentials. How do we pay for that? Taxation of rents that I already talked about is part of the answer, but we can also make those who've used way more than their fair share of our natural resources cover some of the cost. So you have a frequent flyers tax that funds free bus travel. We have a new energy system, for example. So at the moment, these standing charges on electricity and gas mean that the people who use the least energy are paying the most per unit. What about instead if we made the first energy units completely free, and then you had an escalating tariff structure after that, so that the bills for the poorest were really reduced, and then you discourage the sort of profligate, wasteful uses of energy. That's just one idea. There's lots more in the report. The third strategy relates to jobs. So why is it that we associate low levels of growth with rising unemployment? Well, it's because automation and other technological innovations allow us to produce the same amount with less people and less time. And that creates the specter of robots stealing our jobs. And historically, we've relied on consumption growth, consuming more in order to generate more work and avoid rising unemployment. But of course, there's an alternative and more environmentally sustainable way to maintain employment, which is just to share out the remaining work. So instead of using automation and so on to drive down prices and sell more goods, companies could offer their workers a shorter working week at higher hourly pay. That's not a solution that many profit-oriented companies are going to deliver of their own accord. It will require legislation, coordination, and a really major shift in the balance of power in workplaces, so that people who contribute their labor are no longer excluded systematically from decision-making. So we talk about how we might achieve that shift in the balance of power in our report. And finally, I'm conscious of the time. So finally, debt. How do we reduce the threat of debt crisis in a low growth economy? Well, it's probably a good thing that I've run out of time a bit, because this is where it gets super geeky. But there's things like extending the strategic use of the central bank's power of money creation, interest rate holidays and debt cancellation for households who've been pushed into problem debt, shifting from debt to equity financing, discouraging the worst sort of inflationary and risky forms of lending by banks. I can talk more about any of that if it's probably not very obvious from what I've just said, but basically taken together, these strategies not only make our economy more resilient in the face of future shocks like COVID, they also reduce the precarity and exploitation that millions of people suffer under their current system, and they would make it far, far more easier to keep fossil fuels in the ground and halt the destruction of the planet. And the final slide here just shows you the report if you want to go and look it up. There you go. And there's a shorter executive summary as well. People want
Beautiful.
that.
Thank you so much, Beth. And what was so wonderful about that was it was just so obvious. There are just like a myriad solutions out there. We are not short of good ideas. And it's fantastic that those have all been brought together. So thank you so much for that. Hopefully we can move that that slide away. And then
stop share. Yes.
You stop sharing? Yeah, perfect. And then we can move on to Clive Lewis, and who I'm really delighted has joined us, MP for Norwich South and a good friend. Clive.
Thanks, Caroline. And that was the nicest bit of the introduction. Good friend. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'm so impressed and blown away by the presentations that we've just had. I made a couple of notes about some of the things that were said. And I kind of categorized the three speakers into three different kind of distinct categories. So Laura, I thought, was the hope, and Katherine was the positive present, and Beth was the route map. Obviously not personally, but in terms of what you were saying. And I think that those three things there, those three components, really sum up nicely the way that we need to approach this. We need hope. We need to be positive about what's happening, about the different movements, about the different pushes, about the fact that this is increasingly on the political agenda, and the fact that there is a route map to get there. I guess the thing that I'd like to talk about is the theory of transition, which is often a bit more difficult. And how do we've got the route map, but how do we achieve it? And I guess, this petition couldn't have been launched at a more timely moment. Lockdown is again being lifted, we're told, for the last time. And COVID, and after COVID, there's a real wind of opportunity for building back a better, fairer, greener, more sustainable economy. That's the option. Or we could opt for a model of authoritarian capitalism, the likes of which we've never seen before. What I say could. The problem is this government seems to be reading from the latter script in terms of pursuing the kind of dystopian agenda that I think many of us are well aware could happen if we don't change course at a rapid rate of knots. So I think, some of the things that were said about, I want to pick up on what Katherine said. She was looking at different examples, different countries and what they're doing, Scotland, Wales, New Zealand, Finland. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that we can, when we can value our own well-being, begin to measure it and begin to base our economic approach on well-being, then I think it may well be the opportunity for us to also start being able to think about the well-being of the billions of other people on our planet, which I don't think we do at the moment in any kind of way that's in any way sufficient, about their well-being, because these people are at the forefront of the climate crisis. So I think by caring more about ourselves and centering our economy on that, I think it will put us as a country, as the global north, in a better position to care about the well-being of others. So I think that's another reason why it's really important, because either we all succeed on this mission to save our planet, or we all fail. I think everyone understands that now. And I thought Beth's kind of 4-point plan, the 4 goals, kind of tackling rent extraction, safeguarding basic needs, empowering workers, reducing exposure to debt crisis. These are brilliant and they're achievable. But one of the things I think we're going to have to acknowledge is that many governments are not going to commit to that. There is still a big section of our political system who are locked into the vested interests, who are too busy making that profit, too busy siphoning off mass amounts of money, the 1%. And sorry to kind of bring the old left socialism to this, but they are not going to let go of that easily. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a crisis of democracy here in this country and across the Western world. And it's where I think those vested interests are pushing back against the kind of solutions and answers that we've been hearing today, which is about a more caring, more equal, not just country, but planet. And I think that's a threat to them because they like that wealth. The reason they like that wealth is because that wealth equals power, and power equals influence. And that means that influence allows them to keep their wealth. So I think we're going to have to understand that if we want to be able to take on the fossil fuel industry, the banks, the climate destruction they're perpetrating, then we have to understand that we need to reconnect our democracies, which are disconnected. That happened about 40 years ago. We need to reconnect our democracies to being able to take back control over who is making decisions within our economy, both nationally and internationally. And until we do that, then it doesn't make a difference what we say in Parliament. It doesn't make a difference what we say on the streets. Those organizations, those institutions will continue to invest in fossil fuels, continue to invest in the destruction of the ecological world. So I think this is a wonderful chat, a wonderful talk. I think there's a lot of work for us to do. I think ultimately, I often talk about progressive alliances, people working together to be able to take on these issues. The work that me and Caroline do in Parliament on the reset inquiry, on the Green New Deal, working with Layla and the Liberal Democrats who couldn't be here tonight, working with others, I think is part of that. Building movements for change is part of this as well. And I think if we're pragmatic, if we put our heads down, if we understand the scale of the challenge, and we've seen that today, I think anything is possible, and we can't afford to lose. We can't afford not to get our heads around this and to get a grip. So I'll be quiet now and thank the speakers for everything they've contributed tonight.
Thanks so much, Clive. That was absolutely brilliant. And yeah, that movement of people, I think you're absolutely right. And thank you for making the point that we did invite Layla or someone from the Lib Dems. They couldn't make it. We asked several people, but this isn't narrowly party political. It is absolutely about that movement building, and I think it's important to underline that. Time now for some questions. So if people could put questions in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. If you've already put them in the chat, if by any chance you could cut and paste and stick them in the Q&A, that would be marvelous because it makes life a bit easier. And people have started to do some upvoting, which is great because it gives us a sense then of which questions people most want to get answered. And actually, I thought we could start with combining two questions. So it's the first one on the list, the RSA Public Services, who says, how can we get buy-in from people on this when they're only able to focus on the day-to-day challenges of survival? You know, and the future feels too far away and just getting to tomorrow is their priorities. And then there was someone called Wilhelm, who I've just lost. Yes, Willem was saying, does the Gilets jaunes in France not demonstrate that unless one gets the support of the population, the government can't bring in the necessary changes? So in a way, we're picking up the democracy point that Clive was making. But really talking about, you know, how do we make this feel real and a priority to people who right now are struggling just to put food on a plate and keep a roof over their head. I was going to suggest going in reverse order, but Clive has just disappeared. So maybe I'll go to Beth first, if that's all right.
Hey, great. Yeah, I mean, it's totally essential questions. I'm really glad they were asked. I think that I think that one of the reasons that people balk a little bit when the term degrowth is used is because, you know, if somebody's had been ravaged by 40 years of neoliberalism, then the idea of consuming less is probably going to feel a little bit offensive. And that's why I'm not sure that a politics of less is the way to communicate about this kind of thing. You might have noticed that in that report, those proposals that I set forward, which would reduce our dependence on growth, you can talk about all of those policies without mentioning our growth dependence, without even mentioning environmental sustainability. They're all things that make sense from an economic justice point of view. So what I tried to, if you kind of read through carefully, you realize that ending our dependence on growth is a project that directly speaks to suffering, the suffering of precarity and exhaustion and exploitation under the current system. So it's about diffusing the power of rent extractors. It's about expanding economic democracy. It's about establishing entitlements to our basic share of common wealth and resources. It's about freeing up time for leisure, for caring for one another, for, you know, for democratic deliberation, and protecting people from extractivism, just as our environmental regulations will protect the Earth's living systems from them. So these are these goals of protecting, you know, redesigning our economy so that it can work without ever increasing consumption growth, is one and the same project as addressing the concerns of those who are most marginalized and exploited under the current system, if that makes sense. So I think that, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
That makes real sense. We're not sort of marching to the streets with a placard that's saying, you know, what do we want? No growth. When do we want it now? I mean, it's a bit more sophisticated than that, and actually starting where people's concerns are. Katherine, would you want to add to that?
I mean, so often my best answer is basically what Beth said. So just to underline everything that Beth said, but what I'd add to that is that the fact that people are focusing on just surviving is the very reason why we need to do this. We should be able to hope for more from our economies than people, as a Gilets Jaunes said, we are just focused on getting to the end of the month. That underscores why we need massive economic system change, because in this world of plenty, when we've got more than enough to go around, we're just really, really, really terrible at sharing it. The challenge is making sure that people are not just struggling to get by week, and yet that has been one of the most hideous outcomes of the way the economic system has been very deliberately designed over the last few decades. And so that really just underscores the rationale for things like this wellbeing economy agenda. In the RSA point, in terms of how do you get buy-in for people, I mean, partly it's about beginning where communities are and having conversations and deliberative dialogues with them. And I've been really fortunate in my work over the last few years or decades even to spend time working with communities around the world and listening to what they say really, really matters to them. And there's incredible commonality. As Tim from CUSP would say, this is what makes us innately human. When you have the time to talk to folks about what really matters, they talk about dignity, sense of purpose, their relationships, their mental and physical health, having decent local environment, knowing that they and those they care about are safe. These are the sort of things you'll see replicated in those we all needs that I spoke about earlier. And so bringing those to the fore and ensuring that we have the economy that's designed with those goals at its forefront, rather than what one of my favorite intellectual heroes, Manfred Max Neef, would say, these pseudo-satisfiers that we've got with GDP. We think we've just chase after more GDP and it will fix everything else. GDP has had its chance. We've seen an economy based on GDP and it hasn't cut the mustard. It hasn't delivered for enough people, particularly for folks like the Gilets Jaunes or communities just down the road from me here in Glasgow, where life expectancy is 20 years below that of the rest of the population, or people around the world in communities in the majority world. And so the Wellbeing Economy agenda is explicitly about that. And in terms of deliberative conversations, I'm really heartened by the Citizens Assembly projects. I know they're not perfect and there's lots of ways they can be done better, but I've been really lucky to be involved with a couple of them up here in Scotland. And it is just extraordinary what you see when everyday folk that get the chance to listen to each other and debate and argue. And so keep an eye on some of the recommendations that are coming out, those citizens' assemblies. They match the recommendations in opinion polling, where so many people are saying they don't want to go back for that. So to be honest, really, I'm not worried about this not resonating with people, because I think it absolutely deeply does. The choices and the issue is, as I think Laura said, this is about how do we describe these in compelling stories that make this really seem possible, not just desirable.
Brilliant, thank you, Katherine. And it feeds in actually to a note in the comment in the Q&A. Bridget Napper, again, talking about citizens' assemblies, saying that they can be used to define the top 20 themes that make a good life in their particular area, that then creates a common good index. And Bridget says, the economy for the common good is doing this in regions in Spain and Germany. I think it's really exciting just to see how this is such a kind of international movement. But Laura, can I get some comments from you?
Yeah, I would echo what's been said, and I think this is such an important and crucial question. And I just want to mention that I am personally very aware of my privilege, that I am able to spend so much time on this work. Many people are in this position where they're not able to spend any extra energy. They're just worried about paying rent or getting to the next day or week. And so it's important for those of us who do have the time to be involved in this work, to just be so aware of your privilege, and to hold intersectionality as a really key value, and to understand the intersections of class and race and gender. So I would echo about the part of the strategy, a big part of the strategy to get to this wellbeing economy is meaningful participation, and so getting people to set the agenda and to feel connected and part of a community, and to eventually create this culture of participation. I'm not sure if I said before, but about the sort of disconnection, isolation, alienation of people, that's where we're all at now. But if we can build strength and links between us and build our communities, then people can hopefully start to get involved in that way.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Laura. And Clive, did you want to come in on that?
I guess really just say some of the work that we did on Reset, I mean, I think you mentioned it, was, there were certain themes which came out. And when you took the political frames away, the language, the frames that we use as politicians or from political parties or movements, when you talked about the issues themselves as they affected people in the pandemic, there were certain themes. People wanted more access to green spaces. They wanted to see, better pay for key workers. They wanted to spend more time with their family. They cared about the environment. There were certain themes that came out, which I think anyone, whether you're black, white, your kind of social and economic demographic, man, woman, old, young, educated, uneducated, there was a kind of broad consensus out there. People instinctively get this, which is, I think, why deliberative democracy is such a critical way of being able to engage those people and allow them to realize and place those wants and needs and desires with practical ways of being able to achieve that, which I think the wellbeing economy does. And so that was something that was a real surprise to me, and a pleasant surprise, which is that there is a commonality out there. It's how we communicate it. I think the other thing, and there's a couple of negatives I'll get into, I think it needs to be said. Consumerism as a concept, which is rampant. I think it limits our imagination. George Monbiot talks about this a lot. It actually limits our ability to think about things in a different way. And I suppose that could be true of any paradigm, any kind of dominant paradigm, but definitely with neoliberalism. And I think one of the ways around that is to kind of vividly articulate in bright, bold colors what that different world could look like for you, for your family, for your community. And the deliberative democracy process, when you have people engaging and talking about the different options, I think allows people to do that, to form a consensus. And there is a consensus out there. It can be done. The last thing I'll say, there was a comment from David, which is, I hope the wellbeing economy is something people increasingly see as transcending party politics. Politicizing it often leads to unhelpful, polarized arguments and entrenched positions. I agree with that. I do agree with that. But you've got to understand there are people in politics, and there are certain political parties who are hooked and whose raison d'etre is to defend the status quo and to do as little as possible to change that. I'm not being partisan here. You just have to look at the policies being passed or not being passed to understand that. So it's not being party political, but it's simply saying we need to demand better from all of our political parties, but there are some that have more of a journey than others. It's as simple as that.
Brilliant, thank you, Clive. And the Reset initiative that you spoke about, I'm grateful Cusp put the link to that in the chat. It was basically a project of the all-party group on the Green New Deal, and we did a really big set of kind of opinion polling and so forth about what kind of future people wanted to build back after COVID. And what was so fascinating, as you indicate, really, Clive, was that there was such a commonality, really, and whichever part of the country we're talking about, whatever backgrounds from people were coming from, that was really, really interesting, that people wanted you know, to recognize that going back to normal was nowhere near good enough, because normal's been pretty crap for too many people for too long. So that was really powerful, and the link to that is in the chat. Just looking down the questions, it's quite interesting how many are focusing on the mechanisms that we would need to put in place to make sure that the transition to the kind of society and economy we're describing doesn't hurt the poorest most. David Carver there, putting forward some proposals. What do you think of carbon taxes, border carbon adjustment, changes to domestic personal taxes to achieve net zero carbon without disadvantaging the poorest? Elsewhere, I've seen, I think it was, yes, Sarah Montero talking about, you know, the importance of policies like a universal basic income or a job guarantee, but then posing the very big question in a sense is, well, how do you pay for that? Again, without just racking up more income taxes on those least able to pay. And she puts forward quite a you know, a controversial proposal in a way around, would it have to do with public spending through money printing? In other words, the quantitative easing. I say it's controversial, actually it's not, because we've been quantitative easing for the past God knows how many years actually, since the financial crash and again now. But there's a range of different issues there. So it's about how we pay for it, different kind of tax options, universal basic income, job guarantees, modern monetary theory. Take your pick, my friends, about where you want to start on all of that. And maybe I'll start with Katherine this time.
Thanks, Caroline, and brilliant questions. And I so wish we had more time to keep diving into them. And I want to actually come at that question of how we pay from it from a slightly different perspective, just to recognize that so much of what governments at all levels spend money on now is pretty pathetic and inadequate attempts to undo the damage of an inhumane, unsustainable economic system. And once you start looking at, say, the newspapers or policy announcements through this lens, it really is like an onion. There are so many examples of this. In social policy terms, we might talk about failure demand, just the extent to how much demand on our public institutions is driven by inequality. So think about the top-up wages that we provide people because their employers are not paying them enough or giving them enough hours to put food on the table, the extent of housing benefits that we dish out because the housing market is dysfunctional and driven by rent seeking. Think about, in environmental terms, ecological economists will talk about defensive expenditure, carbon capture, sequestration and storage, cleaning up after bushfires or oil spills, etc., etc. You will see that it's everywhere. We're doing a tiny little project at the moment that's starting to try to tally that up for the Scottish budget and for the budget in a Canadian province. But I think it's something we really need to look at, just how much money gets deployed dealing with the collateral damage of our economic system that ultimately is avoidable if we had created an economy that delivered what people and planet really need. So we distort huge flows of money. I'm going to leave Beth to talk to the MMT and the debt questions because she's an absolute expert in this. But I think the key mantra in all of this, and particularly David's point around how do we support the transition, put the poorest at the forefront of this, is questions about sharing. And that's where I think that, you know, the Green New Deal is such a powerful idea, because it ensures that those who are most shafted by the economic system we've currently got are first served through things like intermediate labour market mechanisms where we're prioritising, for example, who are long-term unemployed at being those ones who are going to deliver energy efficiency measures, for example, and so on, all those sorts of mechanisms. So if we put sharing and social justice at the forefront, then we'll go a good hell of a long way in ensuring that we address from the beginning the inequalities and injustices that are embedded in the current system.
Lovely, thank you. Beth, you've been teed up there now on maybe some of the financial questions. You're just on mute at the minute.
Yeah, so I mean, we have a section on this in the report. What can I say briefly? I mean, yes, the central bank's power of money creation can be used. It has the potential to reduce the burden of both public and private debt. As Caroline alluded to, the Bank of England created £875 billion worth of money for the government over the last decade, and progressives have very long argued that that money could have a much greater positive effect if it was used strategically for social and environmental goals rather than just pumped into the financial sector. We can't just go on printing money limitlessly. We will need to tax that money back out of the system in order to prevent inflation. So we don't, the need for taxation doesn't evaporate just because people discover the central bank's power of money creation. But as I said before, there's so many opportunities for making our tax system fairer, for shifting the burden away from people who are working for their income towards people who are sitting back in control of assets and reaping monopoly profits and dividends and so on. And speculating on assets and so on. And also shifting the burden onto people who are using using just way more than their fair share of resources. Just to pick up, can I just pick up on the basic income question? Is there time?
Yes, definitely.
Just a kind of thought there. So there are kind of two ways of approaching the challenge of helping people to creating a social safety net and making sure people can meet their basic needs. One is cash transfers so that people can buy what they need in the private market, and the other is providing services in kind that we provide collectively. I think it's important not to get carried away with the cash transfer idea and therefore leave no resources left over for the in-kind collective services that we depend upon. There's a great book come out called The Case for Universal Basic Services, written by Anna Coots and Andrew Percy, and they make the argument that in many cases providing things collectively is better for efficiency because you don't have all this money extracted by shareholders. It's better for fairness because you know, say if you're ill, you're going to need to rely much more on the NHS than someone who isn't ill, which is why it makes sense to have the service provided for free at the point of need. It's better for solidarity because we're all there sharing our public transport, brought together in schools and libraries, and so on. So I would just make the case for thinking not just about cash transfers, which do need to be improved. They're very meagre. The UK has some of the lowest levels of out of work support across all advanced economies, but let's also think about public services.
Thank you, Beth. Can I come to Laura and see if you'd like to pick up any of those points?
Sure. I just two things came to mind. Just the first being subsidies, that at the moment the government subsidizes so many harmful industries, and if we can just redirect subsidies, that's one really important flow. And just also, closing tax loopholes and just making sure that we actually do tax the multinational corporations and the billionaires. But I don't know, I'm sort of just thinking like, okay, yeah, like Clive, I don't know, we do know what sort of these things to do, but like I was in Extinction Rebellion before and I sort of left because I was thinking, asking the government to do something just feels pointless. But I suppose, what we're doing here is, gathering. So this is why I was talking about changing the narrative, because we're getting people to believe that this is actually possible, and to put pressure on the government. So I suppose that's what we can do, right? Is to build the strength and the solidarity between us and in our communities, and then put pressure on the government, right? So I don't know, do you have any other words of wisdom for me? Because I just don't have any faith that the government is actually going to do any of these amazing things that, we're all talking about.
Thanks, Laura. Will you throw down a very valid challenge, which I'm hoping Clive might pick up in the short term. I also noticed in the chat, actually, someone called Christina saying, how can you win over the mostly Tory MPs who are set in their ways, don't get the climate crisis and won't get the wellbeing economy? They're in safe seats and don't need to change, which is kind of, I think, the kind of same sentiment in a way that Laura was just outlining. Clive, some thoughts on that?
Yeah.
And any of the other bits that we've just been ranging over?
I was going to give the same answer anyway, which kind of ties in with what you were saying as well. But I think it's going to be very difficult for us to be able to convince this government which is kind of sat on top of our democracy for what it is, under a first past the post system, which basically gives around about 1 million people the ability to dominate the political discourse, wherever those swing seats are, wherever the government or the mainstream media, the people who own our media are billionaires, people who have a vested interest in the current system. They get to dictate really what the key issues are, and they're not going to make these the key issues. They're going to make sure that it's about waving flags or denying racism or whatever it is. That's going to be the issue for the next election, and everyone and all the other political parties, or many of them, will have to try to dance around those issues, and that's just, we're running out of time. We haven't got time for that. So for me, I kind of really feel that if this is a talk, we can talk until we're blue in the face. You actually need to have power. You need power to make this change. And the only way I see us in this country having a system where we can actually achieve power is by having a political system where everyone's vote matters. There's an equality of voting, and we don't have that at the moment. So I think the key to so much of this in this country, it's not a silver bullet. It is a more proportional system of voting, because then what you see is the views of a more diverse and dispersed population then begin to have effect on politics and politicians. And once you get rid of those safe seats, you can't have politicians need to listen to their constituents a lot more then. And that means that they will then, I know that we will be saying to MPs, this is important. We know the Tories are already feeding that. The government are already feeling that, because they are talking about, the Green New Deal, the Green Industrial Revolution, and so on, but it still feels greenwashy. So I think having a more proportional system of voting will basically empower our citizens. That's part of the story. I think it then unlocks an ability to deepen our democracy, broaden it out. That means more deliberative democracy. And I mean embedding that in our institutions, embedding that. Why not have a second chamber that is a rotating, deliberative democratic institution instead of the Lords, so the public actually get to sit and have power and rotate. And so it's exciting what we could do. And I think once you've got that, then all of these policies become far more attractive and far more likely to happen. But whilst you have the political system you do, it beds in the kind of current political philosophy and approach that dominates.
Thanks, Clive.
Can I just come in on a quick point on that? Because I agree with so much of what Clive is saying, but I grew up and was born and bred in a country that, in terms of political architecture, ticks a lot of the boxes of the sort of redesigns of the political, structural and scaffolding questions that we perhaps like to see, people on this call might like to see in the UK. We've got a representative elected second chamber in the House of Representatives, so the equivalent of the House of Commons. We've got what you describe here as a single transferable vote, so we call it preferential voting.
So just tell people where that is.
I'm Australian, sorry. Yeah. I keep getting told how my accent is still very, very obviously Australian. And we've got compulsory voting, so everyone's vote is essentially heard and counted. And even with so much of that, and I think this is something, goes back to something that Clive mentioned almost fleetingly, is media. Because who dominates the massive media in Australia? It's the Murdoch press. and that suffocates the conversation. I mean, some of the scans of the newspaper front pages, just, maybe 14 months ago, during the height of the Australian bushfires, you'd see all the Murdoch press didn't even have pictures of the bushfires. They'd have pictures of, here's someone who got caught robbing a bank, or a cat that got run over, when the whole Southeast Australia is burning up. And then they push the story of, it was arsonists. Well, yeah, arsonists may have lit the match, but it's climate change that made Australia so vulnerable, of course, and scientists have been saying that. What's heartening is that despite that capture, we saw, for example, a letter from 100 big businesses in Australia writing to the government saying, you're being captured by this narrow cabal that's of Murdoch influence press. I won't go on about it, but I just think it's yes, and it's so much. It's building that power from outside. It's propagating those positive stories. It's disrupting from outside governments. It's building change that shows it's possible. I mean, we just need so many different tools in our toolkit, and the exciting thing is that everyone on this call will gravitate to one of those. I mean, not everyone's going to be an activist, not everyone's going to run a community garden, not everyone's going to be a scholar, but just finding your place in that movement, because this movement needs everyone in all our diversity, because that's how we'll start to get there. And I guess the key thing underneath all of that is just to know that you're part of something greater than your individual part. You're part of an amazing movement that is bubbling up around the world. Sorry to interject.
Oh, it was brilliant, Katherine. Thank you so much. And I guess just to add to that, I do think we're at such a critical point just now, and I know we always are, but that sense that throughout all of the horror of COVID, one thing that is clear is that the definition of what's possible can change very fast. You know, it wasn't possible 18 months ago to think about writing off NHS debt overnight, or housing the homeless, or supporting people's incomes. And although all of those measures are imperfect and they won't last as long as we would like, nonetheless, it is now much harder for governments to turn around and say we can't do this stuff, because they've demonstrated that they can. They did find temporarily the magic money tree down the bottom of the garden. So I do think that's something to press on. And also the fact that in so many ways, quite a lot of businesses, I know businesses quite often can be the obstacle, but actually there are more and more alliances like B Corps and others who are doing some really exciting things way ahead of many governments. And maybe just the last thing to say is that, yeah, it depends how it gets framed. But I think there are ways of beginning this conversation with Conservative MPs who would feel less threatened, for example, by a conversation that starts about, why don't we measure what matters? You know, why are we so obsessed by GDP? Why can't we be looking at least at the begin with some parallel indicators? It doesn't necessarily have to replace it straight away, but why aren't we measuring the health of our kids, or the cleanness of the air, or whether or not there's, epidemic levels of obesity or misuse of drugs, or anything else? There's a whole load of things we could think of looking at that could perhaps begin to bring some others on board with us. I'm mindful of time and I want to get a couple more questions in. And actually this one from Tahir kind of speaks to this issue about how we build momentum. They say, in the absence of leadership and joined up thinking from the current government, how can we get local and regional initiatives for alternative economies, jobs, lifestyle, services to a tipping point where the measure for change cannot be ignored at the national level? So that's that sense of how much of what we've all been talking about can be done at a local level, even if the government isn't particularly engaged. And then how do we scale up that local activity to put real pressure on the government? So that is an option for one question. And then there was another one I was hoping that you could look at as well, about the whole concept of enough. I find this fascinating. Can we begin conversations about the concept of enough when more is addictive and seemingly insatiable in our society? And we haven't touched much yet on the whole kind of role of advertising, but it does feel that sort of sits in there somewhere. I was going to come to Laura first. If there's anything within all of that you'd like to pick out and say a few words on.
Sure. So on Tahir's question, yeah, this is definitely something that I am wondering about as well. I think as our local group, one of the things that we're really focusing on is connection and collaboration, and just trying to join up all of the different work that's happening. And the acronym for our group is WEB. And we thought that was quite apt, because we want to try to join everyone together in a way. Wellbeing economics or the wellbeing economy is this sort of overarching goal which every organization that's working for social and environmental justice aims should be able to get behind. So yeah, we're hoping to have an event later this month where we sort of bring together different alternative economics groups, and we hope in the future to increase much more collaboration. I also just wanted to mention a book which I put in the chat before, which is Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot. Yeah, I'm pretty obsessed with George Monbiot, to be honest. The whole stories thing is from him as well. But yeah, he sort of talks about this alienation and belonging. And then in the end, it's sort of, yeah, about human relationships. And in the end, he's talking about the Bernie Sanders campaign, where they managed, or if they'd used the strategies that they developed, they could have reached every adult in the US by just getting volunteers together to just phone and have conversations with people. So like I said about just having actual conversations. Yeah, okay, that's all I'll say.
Thank you very much. That's great. And I agree with you. It's a brilliant book. Beth. can I come to you next?
Yeah, I don't have loads to say. I think that this idea of focusing on enough is a good one, and I just wonder whether you know, people just having more time, you know, if we pursue this sort of reduced working hours goal, people having enough time to really get their, you know, well-being boost from doing things, you know, consuming in an active experiential way, going on their guided tours, or doing gardening, or doing their sports with their friends, or just, you know, loving and playing and caring for each other. Like, I feel like those experiences will massively reduce the sort of psychological pressure that there is to sort of try and boost to try and escape the sort of emptiness that we all sometimes try and escape from by just consuming things. So that, I mean, that's just a short thought. I'll let other people speak.
That was brilliant, Beth. Thank you. Katherine, anything very briefly?
I'll be super quick on the enough question. Just to read the work of Tim Kasser, who's a psychologist from Knox University in the States, and he works deeply about the pressures towards materialism. And one of the things he identifies is how folks who have had economic insecurity in their early years are more vulnerable to materialistic messages, because they have that sense of ontological insecurity. They're anxious about themselves, their identity. And so it behoves on us collectively as a society to put, as we were saying earlier, that sort of social justice, eradication of poverty, and reduction of inequalities at the heart of these conversations, and that will then have that flow-on effect. So, I mean, in a way, it's a really lovely point too, because I often think sort of consumerism is the individual equivalent of the pursuit of GDP, just like profit is the micro-firm equivalent of the pursuit of GDP. It's just, you know, very blinkered, just more and more, and not looking at the quality or distribution. The point to hear made around local to scale up, I mean, just to say, and I'm so excited by seeing how powerful the threat of a good example can be. And that's partly the theory behind WeGo, the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. It's that none of these governments think that they've got there. And I'll give you a confession, I really wanted to profile them and say, these are the champions, the heroes of the wellbeing economy. And they've all said, no, we're not there yet. We're not ready. What they really want to do is learn from each other and exchange and hear from each other and collaborate on shared challenges to go on this journey of continuous improvement. But they're also so much looking at what other governments are doing. And we've just, as of yesterday, submitted a paper to them saying, look what is happening around the world, written by my amazing colleague Amanda. And so there's something, into his point, it's local upwards, but it's sideways up across as well, just, you know, really celebrating where we do see this in practice.
Thank you. Listen, we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to try and do something really mean, which is there's one last question from Andrew Berry. What are the measures of success of a wellbeing economy? And I just wanted to go back really to what Laura first started talking about when you were talking, Laura, about stories and alternative stories. So in the 2 minutes we've got left, I just wondered if each of you might just give some example of how we would know we'd got to a wellbeing economy. What would it look like? How do we sell that story? What's it going to be about? So just literally, you know, 20, 30 seconds each, just to round us off, if that's not too bad. And coming to Laura first.
So yeah, I'd say that when we're in the wellbeing economy, that's when we are each able to do the thing that we are really called to do, and that, you know, we'll be freed to be able to pursue that and get fulfillment from that, and that as a society everyone will benefit from everybody's special thing that they are made to do. So
thank you, that's brilliant. Katherine.
So for me, I agree with Laura, but in terms of how we measure it, there's loads of alternative measures out there. I just don't think they're yet connected enough and resonate with everyday people. And so I have a dream that we will see politicians saying when they're out on the hustings, under their watch, the number of girls who ride their bikes to school will go up. Because imagine if that figure is in place, how many other beautiful contextual factors. So imagine if we had 6 or so of those sorts of measures that I call cornerstone indicators, then we'll know we've got there, but also build the demand for the change we need to see.
Brilliant, thank you. Beth?
Okay, slightly wonky response, which is what you'd probably expect from me. I would imagine a system where instead of allowing, private interests to profit from the control and exploitation of our common resources, instead we would really, really understand that land, water, our climate, our energy resources, our raw materials, these are common resources, these are common assets, they're gifts from nature that we all have a common claim to. And so the scarcity rents arising from these assets would be captured and invested in collective, like public luxury, so that we can all have a, be certain of having access to life's essentials.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And last word to Clive.
I was going to say spending more time with your family, but after lockdown, that probably won't go down well with people. So, as a measure, then I came up with another one, which was that we actually have a global civilization remaining and left. So, that would be a good measure. That's a bit negative. So, I suppose on a positive one, if you wake up in the morning and you feel the joy of life, I think maybe then we're on approach to a well-being economy. Rather than having to think about the commute or what you've got to buy or what bills you've got, you actually wake up happy and looking forward to the week, the day, your life. I think that would be the start of beginnings of knowing that you'd hit the well-being economy.
I love that. Thank you so much, Clive. And thank you so much to everyone. I was just looking through if you look through the chat, loads of people are just saying how inspiring you've all been. So thank you so much. It would be remiss of me not to remind people, if they haven't already done it, to sign Laura's petition. So please, it's in the chat, the link there, or it's on the Parliament website. Please do sign that petition and share it with your friends so we can get up to 10,000 very quickly. So that prompts the government's first response, and then up to 100,000 after that, so we can get the debate. Huge thank you to all of our speakers who've been just so amazing. It's been a fantastic evening. I wish we had longer, actually. We could go into all of that kind of meaning of life stuff that Clive was just getting into, but it's all about that, really, isn't it? So thank you so much. I wish you all a very good evening, and thanks again to our speakers.